and I ended up dating this one girl who I had been attracted to for quite a long time. And when I finally ended up on a date with this girl, I thought, this is it. I've got it figured out. I'm going to end up with this girl for the rest of my life. This is going to be awesome. We go on our first date, and it was a great date. We end up back at her place where, we're clicking, we're connecting, we're getting along, we're talking about tons of things that we have in common.
Sure. Yeah.
And then things start getting a little sexual, and the clothes start coming off. And I get the bright idea that, okay, I have to stop now. I have to show her respect.
Okay.
So I stop, and I get dressed. I leave. I call her, leave a message on her phone, and I never hear from her again. That experience did things to me that I had never expected, that I never even saw coming. I had built up such a rich reality of what our lives would be together.
Yeah.
That when it didn't happen, it just kind of shattered that whole image, that whole idea that I had built up in my mind. And it was extremely, extremely painful. The great thing about that experience, even though it was so painful, was it made me realize, okay, I don't think I'm going to be able to do this on my own. As a result of that, I ended up going and joining Frank's Toronto Lair. And that's where I ended up meeting Frank and learning about the emotional needs for the first time. From that point, I improved by working really hard and studying and getting lots of experience. And I ended up, for the first time, dating multiple girls, getting back my ex, and finally having sex with her after, the 2 or 3 years that we had dated. I dated a girl that I had been attracted to for over 5 years, who always saw me as just a friend. And just generally having some great relationships with some great women. But to touch a little bit more on your question of what is that process?
Right.
Well, it's getting yourself to the point where you can actually have a relationship. A lot of people seem to overlook the fact that a relationship really does take two people. And if you're not in a position where you yourself are capable of having a relationship, if you have any issues of your own that are resulting from childhood trauma, maybe you grew up in an environment where your parents didn't get along, or one parent was absent, or anything like that.
Right.
Those things get wired up into what you think relationships are. If you don't overcome those things, you take that with you into your relationships. It's a type of baggage that is so under the surface, it's so hidden away that you don't even realize that it's there until it starts coming up. And you start finding that your relationship starts to look like those relationships you had that you saw growing up.
Right.
You start, if your parents were, if your parents never got along, you start finding yourselves getting into relationships where you don't get along with the person that you're with. The process of being able to get into good relationships and being good at relationships really starts with getting yourself into a position where that's even possible.
So your focus was really on changing yourself.
Yes, most definitely.
Okay. And how different do you think you are now then? Or how much change was involved?
For me, there was probably more change than I would have anticipated going in. Because at that point, I'd been working on myself and doing self-development and self-improvement stuff, like I mentioned.
Right.
And I had changed quite a bit at that point. I figured, okay, I just have to learn a few things here and there, and I'm just going to be okay.
Sure.
But when I finally got into the study of it seriously, I realized, wow, there are all these things that I need to deal with in order to be able to have a relationship. Things like being decisive. Actually being able to go on a date with a girl, and when she asks you, what are we doing? to learn how to curb that gut reaction of saying, well, what do you want to do?
Yeah. Okay.
I mean, now that I've dealt with that, I cringe whenever anyone asks that.
Yeah.
Because, well, that was something I had to deal with. That was something I had to unwire and unprogram. So the amount of change was substantial. I actually once had somebody ask me this, and I remember not even being able to give them an answer. They asked me, well, what about you has changed? What about you is different? And I'm like, what? Just because the level of change was so profound, the level of change was so deep, that question almost made no sense, just because I went, what do you mean what has changed? Everything's changed. What do you mean what's the biggest change? Everything has changed. Everything about who I am and how I act and the things that I think and how I interact with the rest of the world has changed. The interesting thing about it is, though, that I feel more like myself now than I ever did when I was working on myself, when I was trying to become this way.
Oh, that's interesting. Do you think that's because this sort of more attractive person was in you all along? What do you attribute that to?
I think a large part of the process of change is about being so honest with yourself that you can let out the parts in you that wanted to be out. Be able to say, okay, these are the things that I really want in my life. This is the way that I really want to be. A huge part of guys who tend to end up as a friend, who end up as someone the girls will go, oh, you know, he's a nice guy that I like to spend time with, but he's not necessarily the type of guy that I would want to date. Right. A lot of these guys come from the mindset of, oh, I got to make sure she's happy. I have to make sure she's, satisfied. I need to be the nice guy. What they tend to overlook is that if you don't tell her who you are, if you're not willing to be honest about who you are, she can never trust you. And if she can never trust you, she's never going to date you. A girl doesn't want a guy who's going just to bend the strongest will. They want a guy who's willing to go after the things that he wants in his life and actually knows what those things are and aren't afraid to say them. Do I necessarily think that those things were inside me all along? I don't know, because I think a huge part of it was developed through what I learned through my experience. But I think some part of it was there all along.
Okay, so then tell me about when it first occurred to you to help other people with their love lives.
Well, like I said, I had originally, after that big experience with the girl that I thought was the one, I realized I needed help, and I joined France Toronto Lair.
Right.
While there, I ended up losing my virginity after 3 months of studying with Frank. At that point, I began helping other people who were suffering from issues that I had when I was still a virgin, when I was still relatively inexperienced. And helping the guys like that, helping them and seeing them progress and getting success, it brought about a sense of completion. It really made me feel like I was giving back, and it was just so rewarding that I realized, this is something I could potentially be doing for the rest of my life. Something I learned from Frank is that the meaning that you give to your life is your passion, it's your direction, and it's the thing that keeps you up at night and gets you out of bed in the morning. This was the thing for me. Wanting to help people and help people better their love life in general made me stay up at night thinking about new ways of doing it and new ways of interpreting information and presenting it. And in the morning, it made me jump out of bed and sit down in front of my computer and just write and write and write.
All right. So you actually discovered this pretty early on in your own development then?
It was fairly early on, yes.
Okay.